A person often doesn't realize how fortunate they are until they finish their perfect time in college and hear from their parents, "You're on your own now." I realize this now and agree that it was exactly what we, my wife Nancy and I, needed for motivation. Nancy had parents like mine. After 4 years of college, you become completely on your own. Nancy and I were high school sweethearts, and our parents were supportive of our relationship from the beginning. Both of us had grown up in families with rigid rules. Learn your homework, strive to succeed, keep order. There was an upside to this. Our parents thought we would be the super couple who would achieve everything they didn't. It gave us the freedom to learn and explore the world. From our freshman year of high school, we said, "We're going to go to the same college. We're going to be together forever. I love you, and we're going to get married." We really believed that. We had been in love with each other since we were 6 years old, and our parents pretty much raised us together all those years. After we graduated from college, we got a wake-up call of sorts. We found ourselves in massive debt, penniless, and living on one love. We finally realized what it meant to live beyond our means. My father always said, "You can't live on love." Yes, our parents helped us get settled in life, for which we are very grateful. But after that, they completely let us go, especially after we got married. 3 weeks after receiving our master's degrees, we became Mr. and Mrs. Pelosi, and quickly learned that income is important not only for fun, but also for survival. Before we were married, we didn't think about things like the proteins and carbohydrates necessary for life. That is food. However, our parents took a tough stance. You wanted to get married, now handle it yourself. At first, we tried to get help, hoping for support, but we soon realized we shouldn't count on it. They didn't let us starve to death, but they made us realize that we were on our own and needed to grow up. Nancy had an advantage. As a psychologist by profession, she immediately found a job at a public hospital. Yes, the pay was low, only $9 an hour, but it was $9 we hadn't had before. It was a job, albeit temporary, a paid internship for Nancy's doctoral dissertation. On the other hand, I was offered a job at a well-known grocery store warehouse, the name of which I cannot mention for legal reasons. There I was making as much as $7 an hour. If you added up our incomes, we were still poor, but we could survive. Nancy worked the night shift, and I worked the second shift, so I visited her at night. It was only a 5-minute walk from my job to the hospital. More often than not, I stayed with Nancy for her entire shift. Fortunately, the orderlies and staff were cool about it. Many of them didn't show up at all at night, which was convenient. There were at least 7 people working there on the third shift, but I only met one, and that was by chance. When the patients slept, so did most of the staff, except for Nancy, who took her job very seriously. After a few weeks, I became more relaxed about Nancy being alone in the hospital a couple hours before my shift ended, especially in the wing she was looking after. She had a guardian angel of sorts named Kenneth. I often worried about Nancy, as many of the staff were absent. In the wee hours of the morning, and some of the patients were out of their minds, Kenneth was an exception, the coolest 60-year-old guy I knew. Interestingly, he was a patient diagnosed with manic depression and mild schizophrenia. It later turned out that he was a terrible faker, and the diagnoses were not entirely accurate. This guy was as normal as anyone else, perhaps even smarter. Kenneth was an activist and Peace Corps worker, having spent decades in countries better heard about than visited. His stories about Congo and Rwanda were fascinating, though hard. He seemed like the kindest man. Speaking of goodwill toward men, I often thought that if I were him, I probably wouldn't have lasted. When we first met, I didn't realize Kenneth had a reason to live and be happy despite his diagnosis. He had a yacht, not just any boat, but a state-of-the-art 50-foot sailing yacht. When he first talked about it, I thought, yep, he's nuts. Or, it's an inflatable raft with a sheet on a stick. He also talked about the Mercedes SL, which I also thought was fiction. Nevertheless, I was pleased that he was looking after Nancy until I came along. If Nancy didn't finish her computer work, he sat with her at the front desk, played cards, looked at photo albums, and was a good friend. Kenneth was due to be medically discharged in 2 weeks, at which point it became clear to me why he was in the hospital. It was to allow him to get SSI a few years early by presenting himself as insane. Since you couldn't get SSI as mentally ill and still own a 50-foot sailboat, I later learned that the boat was in his sister's name, as was all the money he earned, which, as it turned out, was quite substantial. Imagine a horticulturist with a master's degree working for an international humanitarian organization for 35 years. He may have made less than $60,000 a year, but he hadn't spent it in 3 decades. Yes, he would probably have accumulated a decent fortune. About a month later, when I started visiting Nancy every night, I noticed that Kenneth was actively flirting with her. It was complimentary and flattering, but it was still serious flirting. Kenneth didn't look like a typical 60-something old man, well-groomed, distinguished, 6 feet 2 inches tall. It didn't bother me. I thought it was funny, and so did Nancy. Nancy could turn the head of even a 90-year-old man. She always worked out before duty in the hospital physical therapy room, usually showing up in spandex shorts, a tank top, and sneakers. She liked that there was no dress code on third shift. She was issued hospital scrubs, but no one controlled what she wore. Anyway, Nancy was fabulous in any outfit. I was a little worried about her being there alone, but Kenneth would protect her, although she could handle almost any man. Brunette, 180 centimeters tall, 54 pounds, very physically fit, with a beautiful face and smile, she attracted the attention of most men, even 90-year-olds. The wing where Nancy worked was more like an extended stay hotel, where some patients could come and go at will. However, Kenneth was always there to watch over her during those hours. One evening I came in and Kenneth was sitting at the desk where Nancy was typing on her laptop. It was always funny because Nancy's conversation went something like this. Uh-huh, gum, uh-oh, uh-huh, uh-huh. She continued typing, listening to him half-heartedly and focusing on her assignment. This evening, however, things were a little different. Kenneth was taking a doctor-prescribed testosterone gel twice a day, which I'm sure made him more excitable than the average 60-year-old man. More often than not, we sat there and chatted about nothing for hours. But that evening, Kenneth suddenly asked, "When are your exams over?" Nancy quickly replied, "Next week, thank God." Kenneth continued, "How would you feel about going on a Gulf and Caribbean cruise with me for about a month?" Nancy looked at me with her mouth half open and replied, "Gosh, that sounds amazing, but we'd have to work this summer to pay for next semester's expenses. I really wish we had a way out, but we're going to have to pass because we definitely can't afford a cruise, any cruise." At that moment, I couldn't help but agree. As soon as she answered, he quickly asked, "How much do you guys make a month?" Nancy laughed and replied, "Not very much." He insisted, "No, really, how much?" We both replied, "Maybe $2,400 with a few extra hours if we were allowed, but about $2,000. At this point, we both nearly fell to the floor. Kenneth offered, "Tell you what, I'll pay you both $1,400 each to help me with things on the boat. I'll give you some money to buy groceries for the trip. You can run a few errands for me before we sail. Just little things. The other 99% of the trip you can just enjoy yourself." Nancy covered her face with both hands, but her expression was unmistakable. She wanted to go. She looked at me and said, "That sounds so cool. How can we say no?" I replied, "Kenneth, you talked us into it." We all giggled and agreed that we would leave in 10 days. I was still puzzled as to how a person with Kenneth's diagnosis could legally operate a boat, especially one this big. I even asked Nancy about it, and she explained that thousands of people with this diagnosis drive cars, trucks, and generally lead normal lives. The only thing that comforted me was that I knew Kenneth was faking it anyway. 10 days later, we ran some of Kenneth's little errands, went shopping, and got ready. When I say got ready, I mean that Nancy just had to get some new swimsuits, go to the tanning salon, buy new shoes, etc. All of this Kenneth insisted on buying, and we gladly didn't say no. Before we left, Kenneth told us, "Now I don't want you to spend the money I'm paying you. If you spend it on this trip, You'll come back with nothing, and then what's the point? We couldn't say no, and it turned out that Kenneth was generous with money. He had spent his life sacrificing for others, and now it was his time. The time spent with us and the money spent on us were great reasons for him to live. The trip was awesome from the start. Even though we had to help out on the boat, we just had a great time. This boat was so automated, it took care of everything itself. You just set the course, and she does the rest. Kenneth just loved our company. I think we made him feel young again. 2 days into the cruise, and about 1,000 pictures later, we found ourselves sitting up late on deck drinking a bottle of Crown Royales. To our surprise, Nancy joined in as well, although she usually preferred lighter drinks. Around midnight, we pulled out our cameras again and started taking silly pictures of each other. Several times, I asked Nancy to sit on Kenneth's lap, and she did. In one of the pictures, Kenneth slid his hand under her right leg as if he was going to lift it up. The moment he did, she looked like she lost her balance a little. When she quickly got into position so she wouldn't fall off his lap, momentarily extending her left leg to lean on the shelf in the main cabin, I took the picture. We laughed about it for a long time afterward. She almost fell to the deck. A few minutes and a few more shots later, I started looking through the photos and came across this particular shot. I'm not sure exactly why, but I was turned on by the sight of her on Kenneth's lap, with his hands under her legs as she spreads them apart. When I found the shot in the camera's memory, however, I didn't know what to do with it, since it was Kenneth's camera, not ours. Eventually, I just left her alone, and we continued to drink and party. Later that evening, we went to our cabins and went to bed. Kenneth always went to bed a little later than we did, checking the boat's systems, making small adjustments, and so on. When we got to our cabin, Nancy collapsed on the bed, and we played around a bit, but I realized she was minutes away from passing out. At this time, I started thinking about that picture again, her on Kenneth's lap, his hands on her. She asked what had gotten into me, and I just grinned and said it was probably the ocean air. Nancy quickly replied, "Wow, we'll have to bottle the air to take home." A few more days passed. We continued to party, and finally arrived in Mexico late one night. Kenneth suggested that we anchor close to shore and wait until morning to go exploring, as there might be some unsavory elements patrolling the area in the evening. This was not a big problem for us. We had a great time on the boat. We grilled constantly on deck, rode the two-seater Sea-Doo, drank frozen margaritas, sipped Crown, and so on. As usual, we pulled out the camera. I drank a little more this time, almost intentionally. Instead of taking random shots, I decided to approach it playfully and asked Nancy to strike poses. We all knew each other well by now, so if I had said, "Baby, do an interesting pose for me," she would do it just for fun. Of course, if I drank too much, the others would follow suit. After a few pictures and jokes, I suggested, "Let me take a picture of you with Kenneth." Nancy jumped up and sat on Kenneth's lap as usual, but this time I said, "Oh, come on. Give me an interesting pose." "Interesting?" She laughed. "Aren't I interesting on my own?" Kenneth laughed quickly and added, "Honey, that's not quite a true statement. You're what men call hot, even for 60-year-olds. Nancy laughed, tucking her hair behind her ear with one hand and raising her legs with a smirk. I snapped a picture and started joking around, pretending to be a professional photographer. Great, now it's even hotter. At one point, Nancy replied, giggling, "Okay, we're talking hotter." Kenneth and I both laughed as he and I began with, "Oh yeah, nerd. Whoa, yes, nerd, baby." Nancy is quite the jokester, no doubt about it, but I knew at some point she would stop and say we were just drunk and should shut up. On the other hand, I wasn't used to Nancy drinking the way she did almost every day, including this one. She was definitely on the road to intoxication. The more we jacked her up, the more she played along with us. Every once in a while, she would pull her top down slightly to show her cleavage, or turn around and stick her buttocks out. After a few minutes, I said again, "More, baby, more, talk to the camera." Then, A smirk appeared on her face, which startled me a little. She settled down on the back deck seat, spread her legs, and, laughing, asked, "So, do I look hot now?" I snapped a picture, replying, "Oh, yeah, that's what I was talking about." She immediately got up from her seat, already almost testing where my limit was. Getting on her elbows and knees, she jutted her ass out, saying, "Okay, I'm done with these antics." Kenneth muttered with a chuckle, "God, I could watch this all night, but I guess we better stop while I can still breathe." Nancy gave a quick laugh and added, "Okay, no more posing on my knees for Kenneth." I was shocked at what Nancy had done. In her sober state, she would never have gone for something like that. We all sat around, talked, told stories, spent the evening, and certainly drank more than we had on our entire vacation. When it got late, we all decided to go to bed. Nancy said she was tired. I said the same thing, but that wasn't really the case. After Nancy spent some time in the cabin, brushing her teeth and getting ready for bed, I told her I wanted to go back to the upper deck. She quickly replied, "If you want to play, you'd better not stay too long." In my already somewhat alcoholic state, I realized I hadn't had enough to drink and decided that Nancy would probably go upstairs herself out of curiosity. I quickly agreed not to take too long, quietly left the cabin, and tiptoed down the dark hallway. There, I noticed the light on in Kenneth's quarters. I decided to see if he was getting ready for bed, or maybe he wanted to drink some more Corona and fish on deck. I hoped that if Nancy's curiosity took over, we would all stay up and party all night. As I approached Kenneth's cabin, I peered through the door opening and got the shock of my life. On Kenneth's monitor screen, one of Nancy's pictures was unfolding, the one where she was striking an interesting pose. I'll say right off the bat, I'm not a fan of peeking, and I didn't expect to see what I saw. I turned away for a few seconds, as if hoping it might have been just a hallucination, but it was real. My thoughts started dealing with Nancy and Kenneth again, but this time they were so intense that I might as well just swing the door open and ask him to explain. Yes, this is where you're going to think I've lost my mind, and I probably have. I stood there for a few seconds as my hormones and fantasies about Nancy reached a fever pitch. At this point, I was already out of my fantasy mind. Then, I walked into the cabin and quickly noticed that Nancy was deeply asleep. So I quietly walked over to our bathroom. Then I, being in my drunken and incredibly horny state, uttered, "If I had a fantasy that drove me crazier than anything else I've ever experienced, would you consider it?" She replied demurely, "Wow, that's an interesting question. No matter what it would be, I would think about it. I'm sure I'd do it if it turned you on that much, or at least try it. How crazy can it be?" I said pretty crazy. Then I asked again, as crazy as it might seem, "Would you at least try it?" As soon as the last word left my lips, she propped herself up on her elbows and asked, "How crazy can it be? We're in the middle of a vast ocean with limited access to anything. What is that?" I replied, "Remember, we're only talking about trying it, not continuing to do it. That's the word try." She then said, "If you can't get over it, that will be the end of it for me, and my answer is no." I reluctantly waited for about 10 seconds while she looked expectantly into my eyes and finally uttered, really fantasized about watching you make love to another man." Then she replied, "Let's try that. We're married, and yes, I admit that it's, as you said, a wild twist. I would even say psychotic, but let's continue with what we were talking about, husband. Go ahead. Do you really think another man would want me?" I replied, "Don't ask me why, because I can't answer that. I just feel like it would be the most arousing thing I've ever done in my life. For once." She smiled and said, "We are in the middle of the ocean, and I'm sure you don't mean Kenneth, our vacation friend, right?" She laughed and continued, "Where did you get the idea that Kenneth would want me? I'm almost a third older than him, and he looks at me like I'm Michael's good friend." Then I said in my drunken, incredibly horny state, "If I had a fantasy that drove me crazier than anything I've ever experienced, would you consider it?" She replied demurely, "Wow, okay, I'm interested in you. No matter what it would be, I would think about it. I'm sure I'd do it if it turned you on that much, or at least try it. How crazy could it be? I replied, pretty crazy. I repeated, as crazy as it might seem. Would you at least try it? As soon as the last word left my mouth, she propped herself up on her elbows and asked, how crazy could it be? We're in the middle of the ocean with limited access to anything. What is that? I replied, remember, we're only talking about trying, not continuing this. That's why I use the word try. Then she said, if you don't come out with it, I'm done, and my answer is no. I reluctantly waited for about 10 seconds while she stared expectantly into my eyes and finally mouthed, I, really fantasized about watching you make love to another man. She replied, let's try it. We're married, and yes, I'll admit that it is, as you said, a wild turn. I'd even say psychotic, but let's pick up where we left off. Do you really think another man would want me? I replied, don't ask me why, because I can't answer that. I just feel like it would be the most arousing thing I've ever done in my life, for once. She smiled and said, we're in the middle of the ocean, and I'm sure you don't mean Kenneth, our vacation friend, right? She laughed and continued, where did you get the idea that Kenneth would want me? I'm almost a third older than him, and he looks at me like I'm Michael's good friend. I then said, trust me, he would love to want you, and sometimes he looks at you differently. She replied, oh, so that's Kenneth? Wild isn't the right word, Michael. Even if I were 100% sure he'd try your fantasy without dropping us off the ship in Mexico for being crazy, I don't know. I might consider it. Yeah, I've said in the past that I want us to try something new, but it's not even in that universe. I don't mind you having crazy fantasies, but this one is off the charts, baby. There's no way of knowing how he'll take it, so there's no way we're ruining this trip for your fantasy. I countered, if I could prove to you 100% that he'd want you, would you try it? I could. I would consider it, but I know it's impossible, Michael. So, no, we can't risk him thinking we're a couple of scumbags and dropping us off this boat. How are we going to get home? Then I said, remember how I said tonight that I wanted to go back to the upper deck? Yeah, what about it? I continued, you fell asleep, so I left the room, walked down the hall, went over to Kenneth's quarters to see if he was going back to the upper deck, and well, anyway, she interrupted. Why would you want to know that? Don't all men do that, Michael? Is that proof that he wants me? I said, wait, I didn't go to his room to spy on him, but since you asked, yes, I did look, but only at that picture of you lying on the deck. He put it on the monitor, and, well, he was looking at it in a special way. I'd seen Nancy dazed before, but never like this. She was doing her best to deny even the possibility of my fantasy. Her mouth was half open, and she froze in place for 15 seconds. It was like a I told you so bomb blast. Then she collected herself and asked, are you sure it was a picture of me? It couldn't have been some kind of pornography. It was definitely me. Was he really looking at my picture? I said, yes, I swear on our marriage. Then she looked out of the corner of her eye and uttered, I'm not sure I can believe that. Basically, yes, he's a bit of a flirt, but it's nothing more than that. It must be just nonsense. I replied, maybe he didn't want anyone to see his computer monitor, but I figured you might think that, and because I assumed you might say that, I'm going to show you something, and I don't want you to think I'm even crazier than you already think. She laughed and said, trust me, you're almost as crazy as I am right now. Her mouth opened wide, and she instantly raised herself up on the bed. Oh, Michael, what did you do here? Did you ask him if you could have this or something to show me? She silently held the sheet to her mouth. Then she rose up in bed, wrapped her arms around her knees, and rested her cheek against her knees, staring toward the wall, sat like that for a few seconds, then lifted her head, rested her chin on her knees, and asked, well, how are we going to do this? I'll just walk up to him and say, excuse me, Kenneth, if it's not too much trouble, could you please love me? Oh, I almost forgot. Is it okay if Michael watches? I smiled and replied, no, of course not. One of these nights, when the timing is right and we're all having fun, I'll go downstairs and you can stay upstairs with Kenneth. And if we drink enough, maybe Yeah, you just say. Michael and I have been talking, and I want to ask you if you'd like to make love to me. Michael's okay with that. She interrupted me. Wait a minute. What were you going to say? I replied, Trust me, I know more than you think, but there's no place on the ship where I can't see him from the window below. She giggled and said, Wow, so you really are a perverted voyeur. Your fantasy isn't about me making love to another guy, it's about you watching it. I replied, Yeah, I can't explain it. I moved closer and started kissing her, and we fell back into passionate caresses. It shocked me that this was happening in reality. The thought that my fantasies could become reality amazed me. Most of my dreams were just fantasies, but now it was becoming a possibility, and Nancy was willing to explore it with me. I realized that the only guarantee of my fantasy was that perhaps it would remain just a fantasy. I now realized that it would probably be just that. Then she said, Michael, you're already drunk. Do you realize what you're doing? Damn it. We both need psychological help. Her words made me think. She tried to put me off by mentioning that she had been skipping pills this month. Meanwhile, I persistently nudged her to lie on her back. The look on her face was the look I'd seen when she jumped off a 40-foot cliff into the lake. I leaned over and kissed her, saying, Honey, this is just an experiment. It's something completely new. She only looked at me with the same look in return. Moments after our incident, I felt a deep guilt. I started to say, Sweetie, maybe this isn't such a good idea. Let's just enjoy our vacation and not do anything stupid. She, on the other hand, moving her hips, objected wryly, Oh, really? Are we done already? Don't you want Kenneth to want me right now? Why wouldn't he? Maybe because I missed a few pills this month, I'll have a better chance of getting pregnant. I just put my head down on her hair and neck, saying, Okay, I see what you mean. Damn, bad idea. Her comments were starting to turn me on. The harder she tried to explain her point of view, the more I began to imagine her punishing me. When I lifted my head up and began to kiss her slowly, I felt it only inflame her. As I started to slowly move my hips, she asked, Are you listening? I quickly replied, Yes. Then I added, Okay, that's enough. You've made your point, but, there was no mention of family planning in my fantasies. I hesitated, not knowing what to say, because honestly, I was going back to my fantasies with even more gusto than before. Looking back now, I realized that perhaps if she had remained silent, we would have stopped and moved on. However, her mentions of Kenneth, pregnancy, and all that stuff made me fall even deeper into my fantasies. Don't get me wrong, it was my fault entirely. She was just trying to make her point as clearly as possible, so I would understand. And, I did understand something, but not in the way she wanted me to, I think. When I hesitated to answer, she raised her eyebrows and said sarcastically, No problem, you're right. Let's explore our carnal instincts. Heck, there are 2 men on this boat. Why don't I take advantage of that? It increases my chances of having a baby. Has Kenneth come on deck yet? I think it's a good time for us to have some fun. I embarrassedly replied, I'm sorry, Nancy, that was stupid. I'm crazy. But honestly, it wasn't that bad. She interrupted me as soon as I said but. Gosh, Michael, imagine you went to get groceries on the beach and came back. And here we are with Kenneth and me as a love couple. Would you accept that? I firmly assured her that it was wrong and that I had made a mistake. Everything that had happened that evening was just an alcohol-induced fantasy that was far from reality. Half an hour later, we both fell asleep in each other's arms. I woke her up several times during the night. By this point, I was completely honest about my fantasies. I was exhausted, but the psychotic idea was still with me. I watched the sun peek through the cabin window and said, Tell me again about how Kenneth wants you. She replied loudly, snuggling up to me, Damn it, if that's what you want, you'll get it, Michael. I hope you don't regret it. I might even like it. Have you thought about that? Around 9 in the morning, I woke up, leaving Nancy asleep, and left the cabin. I started each morning by riding the Sea-Doo Wave Runner to shore, or running along the shoreline. This time, I woke up with Kenneth already gone. He always got up very early. I knew he had set off on the wave runner toward shore, but there was no telling when he would be back. Owning complete freedom on the boat, I took my time to find out when I could take the Sea-Doo. I ate a protein bar in the galley, put on shorts, and went for a walk. The morning was delightful. Fresh ocean air, 81 degrees with no humidity. Just perfect weather. After an hour-and-a-half ride along the shoreline, I returned and noticed that Kenneth had gotten back a little before me. The wind was blowing in my face, and the smell of a gas grill wafted 100 yards away from the boat. As I approached the spot, I saw that Kenneth had already fired up the grill, as he sometimes did in the mornings. We joked that some of the fish we caught and grilled would be the perfect breakfast, and Kenneth made sure we had all the ingredients we needed. Nancy was always watching her health, but couldn't resist the thought of scrambled eggs and sausage for breakfast. She mentioned it when we were in the middle of the Gulf. Kenneth remembered that morning when I went ashore to get sausage and fresh eggs to cook, especially for her, returning in the back of the boat. As I pulled up, Kenneth greeted me with, "Hey, you're just in time. Go wake up the pretty lady. She wants a real American breakfast." I quickly replied, "Gosh, Kenneth, you're making the local fishermen swim to the boat. It smells so wonderful." Kenneth smiled as always and repeated, "Go get Miss Pelosi. I cooked this so she wouldn't miss the American breakfast." Despite his dietary preferences like flax seeds and green tea, she was looking forward to scrambled eggs and sausage, and it took me an hour to find Jimmy Dean's. Looking in the mirror at my disheveled hair fluttering in the wind, I noticed that behind me, Nancy was already putting on her panties. She lifted her ass off the bed and pulled them off. I asked, "When did you have time to put your panties on?" She replied sarcastically, "Damn it, Michael, what does it matter? You must have been drunk if you didn't see me put them on before the sun even rose. Remember?" I silently waved it off and walked out of the cabin, heading toward the smell of breakfast. When I got to the table, Kenneth had already set a plate with a huge amount of food on it. I quickly replied, "She's on her way." At that moment, Nancy came out of the main cabin down the stairs, and it even took my breath away. She was wearing Victoria's Secret panties, not swim trunks, but panties that emphasized her shaved, intimate area. In addition, she was wearing a bright orange, tight tank top. Kenneth had seen Nancy in gym clothes back at the senior citizens gym, but this was completely different. After all, the difference between gym shorts and sneakers, and almost see-through panties with a tight top with no bra, was obvious. She gave me a fleeting glance and walked past in silence. She then made her way toward Kenneth, who, immersed in preparing breakfast, paid no attention to her appearance. I admired how wonderful her ass looked in those panties. I was already beyond my fantasies, but as it turned out, Nancy hadn't gotten me to that point yet. Kenneth, in his "it's okay" style, but turned around and asked, "Whoa, honey, did you forget to put your shorts on?" Nancy only waved her hand and replied, "So what? Panties, bikini, does it really matter?" Kenneth quickly retorted, "Not at all. It's your boat, honey. You can wear whatever you want, whenever you want. It's your right." I knew that at that moment Nancy was playing with me in full view of Kenneth. She was trying to arouse him, and it was clear to me that she expected me to react. It was like a game of tag, where every move was carefully tested. After hugging Kenneth, Nancy stepped back, thanking him for his favorite breakfast. Then slowly made her way to the couch on the back deck, looking back at me only for a moment. She knew for a fact that I knew exactly what was going on, and she couldn't get enough of it. Walking over to the bench, Nancy sat down and carelessly spread her legs over the edge. She leaned her head back and sighed. "God, I'm so tired." This moment really shook me. "Well, Nancy," I quickly tossed as she threw back her head, "maybe we should go downstairs and get ready for parasailing on the coast?" Nancy slowly raised her head and replied, "I think we should just enjoy ourselves on the boat." I was like stumped, completely taken aback by her behavior, but I guess she wasn't done yet. Kenneth, finishing his breakfast, suddenly turned away and exclaimed, "Well, what a morning. I'm sorry. Sit down more comfortably. It's all right." Then Nancy stood up and said, "I'm sorry, Kenneth. I didn't mean to assume too comfortable a posture." At this point, I realized that she was trying to make amends for my fantasies and embarrass Kenneth with her behavior. She didn't care what Kenneth might say or do. She only cared about achieving her goal. And the strangest thing about it was that I didn't protest the situation, hoping it would end quickly. But Kenneth didn't realize that someone was watching him, considering her, and I thought she might say something, but she was silent. Kenneth placed breakfast in front of Nancy, trying to act like a gentleman, but Nancy was one step ahead. She put her feet away and suggested, "Kenneth, let's get a picture of you sitting on my lap." Kenneth, considerably larger and heavier than Nancy, only laughed and replied, "Here we go," jokingly pretending he was going to sit on her lap. In response, Nancy grabbed the edge of his shorts and he got in the back seat. As he lowered himself down, he stated, "Wow, let's take this picture. I'll try not to crush you." I grabbed my camera, hoping that after a few pictures I could change the course of events and explain to Nancy how deep my mistake with those fantasies had been. The first pictures looked innocent enough, but then Nancy suggested, "Let's do something a little hotter." When Kenneth jokingly struck a pose, Nancy joked by hugging his left leg as he stood in front of her. I took a few pictures when she said, "Sit down, Kenneth," and he obediently sat down. Nancy suggested, "Let's do something special." She knew for a fact that this was confusing to me, but she continued to demonstrate her point. When Kenneth was already seated and ready for anything, she threw her right leg over his lap. He put his hands on her hips for support, and she took his hands and placed them against her ass, jokingly clarifying, "That's better." Kenneth was a little confused and didn't realize what was going on. Nancy continued to kiss him and replied, "I'm not sure. Is that okay? I actually think it's pretty good, though." I stood back taking a few pictures, not sure if I was hitting the mark, but her passion fascinated me. I knew she could have said something like, "Screw this cruise, let's go," but I didn't say anything because it excited me. When she leaned over and kissed Kenneth on the cheek, I put the camera down and came up behind her, hugged her hard, and started kissing her passionately, not letting her speak. I didn't know what she was going to say. At this time, Kenneth just sat there, hands down on her legs, completely in shock. Nancy got up on her elbows and looked at me with an expression as if to say, "I can't believe we just did that." Then she said, "I need toilet paper." I instantly stood up and said, "I'll get it." But she replied, "No, I need a roll." I pulled the roll out from under the sink and held it out to her. Nancy started unrolling it, about 3 feet. She was cold to me at this point, probably because of my violent outburst, but I think she was also angry at herself for giving me this opportunity. To this day, I'm still not sure for sure. The next morning, the smell of the grill hit me. I looked back at the clock, 6:23 in the morning. Rising slowly, I put on my shorts, leaving Nancy to sleep in. As I went upstairs, I saw Kenneth near the grill with smoke billowing from it. In his usual style, he said, "Good morning, sunshine. I hope you enjoy the sea bass, Nancy." "Don't worry, I didn't catch it, but defrosted it right out of the freezer." I replied, "Mr. Kenneth, would you make macaroni and cheese on this grill? It would make it even more delicious." We had been there alone for about an hour and a half when I noticed Nancy poke her head out from under the deck. She yawned and gathered her hair into a ponytail. Taking a bite on the deck, she jokingly asked, "Oh, you guys did all this for me?" Kenneth replied with a smile, "Anything for you, sweetheart." As she descended to the bottom of the stairs, I didn't immediately notice her tight tank top, quite plain. But as she ascended, I began to notice that she was wearing only the same panties she had put on about 5 hours ago. The difference between the swimsuit underwear and the panties was barely noticeable, but she was impeccably confident. I only shrugged slightly, but she clearly wanted my attention or jealousy. As Kenneth's thoughts turned away from the grill, he said jokingly, "Those have got to be the cutest panties I've ever seen." Nancy smiled and looked at me, replying in the same vein, "Oh, Kenneth, thank you, dear. A woman just has to make her man happy, doesn't she?" Kenneth smiled again and added, "Love, it's your yacht. You can wear whatever you want, whenever you want, or nothing at all, as far as I'm concerned. I'm glad you're both relaxed and having a good time. What would I do without you guys? You're very important to me." An hour or so later, as we enjoyed sea bass and drank juice, and Nancy, of course, sat with her feet up on the seat. Then we got dressed and went down to the shore. On shore, we did some crazy shopping, but not with our own money, but with Kenneth's money. As usual, he insisted on buying everything Nancy wanted, so much so that he took offense if we tried to use our own money. She was beginning to be spoiled, too. He really loved us and was willing to do whatever it took to make us happy. One day, in jest, he said, "You guys are my best friends." I think he really felt that way. Kenneth had been so isolated from friends and family in his career, hadn't married or had children, and his only close people were either overseas or had already passed away. Eventually, we became like family to him. One day, we had to go back to the boat so Nancy could drop off her knickknacks, hats, shorts, new bathing suits, and the like. The day was coming to an end, and we ended up at the patio bar by the bay. At one point, Nancy asked, "Are we becoming alcoholics? I've enjoyed alcohol almost every day for the last 3 days." Kenneth replied, "Hey, this is a vacation, not a job. We're just enjoying the time, so no, we're not alcoholics. Look on the bright side. It's impossible to be in Mexico and not try a margarita or other alcohol." Nancy laughed and said, "Well, if that's the case, you're my perfect companion. I feel so much better now. I'll just control myself, and you guys just take care of me." We sat and talked for about 2 hours, discussing everything that came to mind. Finally, we decided to head back to the boat. There was to be a big party at the bar later that evening, and Nancy expressed a desire to shower and change before we arrived. We returned to the yacht, spent a little time, and started getting ready for the party. It was a special occasion, as it was the 10th anniversary of the establishment that evening. We returned to the yacht around 19 o'clock and rested for a while, and then around 21 o'clock we showered and started getting ready. I was ready in 10 minutes, and Nancy took a little longer. Kenneth and I sat on the deck and waited for Nancy to finish. We got the dinghy ready for the back deck so we could make a quick trip to shore as soon as she was up. When I got up to check on Nancy, she suddenly came out from above and completely stunned Kenneth and me. I had seen Nancy dressed up 1,000 times before, but this time she set a whole new standard. She wore a floral print miniskirt, the outfit she had chosen earlier in the day, and she looked amazing. She had on a white cotton knit top that was sheer but stylish. Her bra was visible but was neatly done. The miniskirt fit perfectly, emphasizing her figure and making me admire her. I figured she probably used baby lotion on her legs because their skin was so smooth, shiny, and tanned like never before. Her shoes totally completed the look, high shoes with 4 5-inch heels that perfectly accentuated her beautiful legs. One strap went over her toes and the other over her ankles. She looked unparalleled. Kenneth instantly said, you look amazing." She stepped gracefully forward on her heels and hugged Kenneth, thanking him. I expressed my compliments as she hugged me too. After helping her climb aboard the boat, we headed for shore. I was amazed at the number of people gathered there. Even halfway to shore, you could already hear loud music and see flashing lights. Once ashore, Kenneth gave some teenagers $20 each to look after the boat as usual. He explained that this was much safer than just leaving it at the marina, where the risk of losing it was high. He assured us that these teenagers would protect our boat at the cost of their lives because it was important to them that we came back to them every time. It was a small business for them. Before leaving the boat, Nancy took off her shoes and we headed toward the bar. Once at the bar, Nancy started putting on her shoes. It may not seem serious, but every time she lifted her foot to fasten her shoes around her ankle, it was very seductive. Her panties flashed before our eyes. Kenneth watched this process in silence, but it was obvious that he was shifting his gaze from one foot to the other several times. Soon, we made our way to the bar, found a table, and began our drinks. After about an hour, Nancy suddenly asked, "Who will dance with me?" We both waved our hands in an attempt to decline the invitation, expressing the need to wait and not make ourselves look ridiculous on a crowded dance floor. She kept insisting until I finally blurted out, "Okay, okay." When we got outside, Nancy began to get my attention with her moves. She was a great dancer, and under the influence of the alcohol and her outfit, she immediately caught my attention. She just stood out amongst all of the women present. Several guys couldn't take their eyes off her. We started dancing, and I pulled her to me, and she started moving in an "I've had a few drinks" kind of way. I was facing our table, and Nancy was standing with her back to it. Kenneth couldn't help but notice her, but tried to maintain his composure, gazing into his drink or somewhere off to the side, avoiding focused attention on her figure. After a while, I decided to take a chance and went further, grabbing her ass and inviting her closer. She responded positively. My fingers slid lower, lifting her skirt a couple inches, but she stopped me by pulling it back down. It was clear that this had a profound effect on Kenneth. When the music died down, we went back to our table, and the guys continued to watch her every move. The bar was hot, due to the large number of people. Nancy wiped the sweat from her forehead and blushed at the attention she was getting. As we sat down at a table, she took the beer from Kenneth, wiped the frosty bottle on her face, and pressed herself against me, placing both of her beautiful feet on Kenneth's lap, saying, "These feet are so tired." Kenneth smiled and said, "Just a second." He began to undo the straps on her shoes, and Nancy spread her legs so he could more easily reach the clasp on her ankles. I was stunned at the erotic thoughts. She was blatantly flirting with him. Throughout the evening, Nancy continued to amaze us with her exquisite and flirtatious moves. We decided to return to the yacht, although she was clearly not ready for bed and was ready to keep the party going. Because of the testosterone gel that Kenneth used regularly, he was as hardy as a 20-year-old guy in his 60s. When Nancy mentioned his savage ideas a few times, he simply said, "Hey, that's what we're here for." We got back to the boat, and Nancy was in fine form. I expected her to chastise me for my unbridled thoughts and eventually make me tell her to calm down or stop the blatant flirting. But not a few minutes after our arrival, we all grabbed tequila. We were already in a good mood, and the tequila only enhanced that by making us a little intoxicated. After a few minutes, the conversation with Nancy moved into an area that even I wasn't sure about. I didn't know how she came to the topic. Beginning with simple, inquisitive questions, she asked, "Why didn't you ever get married? Don't you want to settle down with someone?" And continued, "When was the last time you kissed a woman? And when was the last time you made love to a woman?" Kenneth just smiled back, not answering her questions directly, only softly saying something like, "Oh, it's been too long." Although we had known each other well for a long time and often bantered with each other, I wasn't sure where this was going. Eventually Nancy got off topic, but my mind was already preoccupied with dirty ideas. Several times I excused myself, as if to use the restroom. On my third time back upstairs, I saw Nancy rubbing Kenneth's feet. It wasn't particularly surprising, just something Kenneth would do. While he was rubbing her feet, Nancy was making very erotic noises, which made her in seventh heaven from the pleasure of using the aloe gel on her feet. We continued to chat as usual. Every now and then Kenneth would caress her legs, just relaxing. Nancy's skirt was getting higher by the minute because she would occasionally spread her legs, but this was nothing out of the ordinary, for Kenneth had already seen her in panties and various swimsuits. The more he massaged, the more Nancy liked it. I realized she was trying to get me aroused, but on the other hand, she was genuinely enjoying what was happening. Eventually, Kenneth was above her knees, and the gel was covering her legs. After a few minutes, Nancy started driving her thumbs under her skirt and making a face like it was painful when I did something that could conceivably be the start of something bigger. When she did it a third time, I said, "Why don't you take them off? It's not like we've never seen your panties before." Then she looked at me and said, "Okay, do you want to check?" Kenneth remained silent, just sipping his drink, trying not to spill it from her deft hands, and swallowed. Nancy quickly threw back her skirt, got up from the seat, and climbed off of it. Kenneth tried to look as normal as possible, but it was obvious he was a little disheveled, just like the rest of us. The sight of Nancy in her tight panties was certainly delightful. After a while, Kenneth began massaging her legs and feet, and Nancy propped herself up on her elbows, took a sip of tequila from the bottle, paused as if trying not to burp, and asked, "Boy, you're quite the massage master, buddy. When was the last time you kissed a woman?" Kenneth tried to smile and replied, "Oh, I'd love to do that, especially after such a hard day." Nancy asked again, "And when was the last time you kissed a woman?" He grinned again and replied, "Let's just say it was a while ago." Nancy said, "Well, you deserve a kiss, buddy." Kenneth gave a quick smile and replied, "Then I'll take it, as long as your husband doesn't mind." I immediately added, "Hey, I think you deserve one too." As Kenneth finished massaging her legs and feet, Nancy looked at me for a moment, rose to her knees, and leaned into Kenneth. After a moment, she kissed him gently on the lips. Kenneth was quick on the uptake and began to respond to her kiss. While they were kissing, I was kind of on autopilot. After a couple dozen seconds, I said, "Now that's really good pay for a massage. Maybe I can get a kiss too?" Kenneth laughed quickly and replied, "Wow, thanks, but you better go kiss your boyfriend before he throws me overboard, or I have a heart attack." Nancy replied with a smirk, "I don't think he'll worry about that." As she approached me, I couldn't wait to get to her. As soon as she leaned in to kiss me, I rolled her over next to me and we continued our kiss. At this point, I suddenly said, "Kenneth, if you take off your shorts, you can reach your drink better." He laughed back, "Yeah, I guess you're right," and only grinned, remaining seated next to me. Nancy looked at me silently, panting. She pulled me against her again and began kissing me. As she did so, she took my cheeks in her hands, ran them down the right side of my face toward Kenneth, and whispered, "You have quite got to be kidding me." I just kept kissing her and jokingly got up and said, "Okay, take a break. I need a shot of tequila after all this." Raising the bottle of tequila to my mouth, I looked back up and breathed in admiration as I looked at Nancy laying there. She was just lying there, spreading her legs, one on the floor and the other on the back of the bench. Folding her hands behind her head, she was relaxing without saying a word. I was already pretty drunk at this point. After a few seconds, Nancy slid her foot off the seat, turned around, and stood up. God, she looked amazing, in just a knit white top and bra. As she walked over to us, she sat down next to Kenneth and picked up her glass that she had been drinking earlier. She tipped it over and finished the last third of the glass. After about 20 seconds, Kenneth moved closer to her face and they started kissing. I thought she was too uptight and just caught up in the moment when she said that, but I also thought she still wanted him to back off. After all, that's what she meant, and Kenneth decided to interpret her words in his own way. Then she got up and said, "I'm going to bed." I waited a few minutes before I went downstairs. I wanted to give her time so she wouldn't say or do anything she might get spanked for. I continued to comfort Kenneth, who had fulfilled a lifelong dream and was truly sorry for the way things had turned out. After all, I was the one who orchestrated this whole situation between Nancy and Kenneth, and their feelings were completely on me. When Kenneth calmed down, I told him I was going to go check on Nancy. He immediately agreed, and I went to find her. As soon as I opened the door to our cabin, she was sitting on the edge of the bed. I slowly closed the door, leaned against the wall, and stayed silent. This seemed to alert Nancy, and soon she asked, "A little more than you expected, right? You're upset with me, aren't you?" I didn't care except for one thing. It was the first time she'd ever had a real orgasm with another man. But I could only be upset because I had created this whole situation myself. As I stood there looking up at the ceiling, she came over to me and started asking, "Answer me. It went horribly wrong, didn't it? I didn't realize things would turn out this way. I'm sorry, but it was so forbidden. So wrong. I have so many thoughts in my head." She sighed and continued slowly, "Honestly, everything felt so forbidden, so wrong, almost animalistic. I was nervous, frustrated, horny, and I even wondered how you looked at us when we made love." She started to say something else, but I interrupted her by starting to kiss her. After a few seconds, she retreated to the edge of the bed and whispered, "I want you so bad. God, I want you." I was so turned on that I started talking in a way that wasn't particularly meaningful. After a few words, I realized that Nancy was really horny. When I thought I couldn't be more surprised, Nancy began to playfully repeat erotic phrases. Did you enjoy watching him enjoy me? Did you enjoy it? Feeling his cum inside me. Now, I could no longer remember what preceded all of these events, and I wasn't sure if I had voiced my approval or not. I especially couldn't remember the phrase, "Indeed you did." With interest, I replied, "To what exactly?" She made a playful expression and said, "Well, you know what to say." I jokingly interjected, "No, what exactly?" "If I was right, you should tell me." She paused, looking me in the eye, and uttered, "Damn, Kenneth, whatever. You wanted this, didn't you? For me to enjoy it?" I quickly replied, a little taken aback, "Oh, sure." As I tried to figure out what she was getting at, I realized that I hadn't even imagined that things could work out this way. I added, "It was amazing. I'd love to watch him want you 3 times a day." Part of me was hoping to hear back, "No, once is enough." But she didn't say that. She only opened her mouth slightly and added, "My God, Michael, I know you liked it, but there's no way I could do it that often. Did you really like it that much?" When she said that, it was like she came back to reality and kissed me, saying, "I don't think we should do this again. Let's not discuss it again tonight. Remember, we are married, and I shouldn't have sexual intercourse with other men, and you shouldn't enjoy the sight of someone wanting me." As I calmed down, it became clear to me that she was right. We are married, and this all has to end. It's not going to be easy to behave around each other after all that has happened. Eventually, we went to bed. I didn't lay on my back as I usually did, but just lay there, thinking about meeting Kenneth the next morning. When we woke up, I decided to kiss Nancy, but she immediately rolled off the bed and ran to the bathroom. That moment was a turning point, and I decided to go up to the upper deck to smooth over any possible misunderstandings with Kenneth. As I made my way across the deck, I immediately saw Kenneth on the back deck scuba diving. Before I could say anything, he came up to me. "Hey, good morning. I caught a red snapper you're going to love." I began, "Kenneth, about last night. I hope you don't think badly of us. He interrupted me. "Hey, it's okay. It was the ocean air, alcohol, crazy circumstances, and all that. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. I'm glad you didn't come here to kick me overboard." I admitted that I'd had too much to drink, that a rampant fantasy had gotten out of control, that Nancy had been victimized, and the like. Kenneth comforted me, telling me that it was okay, that these things happen, and it didn't make us bad people, but rather strengthened our relationship. I felt like a weight had been lifted off of me, but knew that we would need to talk to Nancy again as soon as the moment was right. After a while, Nancy came up on deck. I was taken aback by the fact that she acted as if nothing had happened. She didn't seem embarrassed or in a strange mood. Everything seemed to have passed her by. This confused me a bit. I even hoped she would say something, but I quickly realized that she was taking the situation much more calmly than I was, which is perfectly normal under the circumstances. We started the day as usual. We had breakfast, went to the beach, and looked around at a few ruins. Late in the afternoon, as we got ready to head back to the boat, Nancy suggested, "Let's get a room on the beach, take a real shower, and have food and drinks brought to us. It will be a great vacation." Kenneth immediately agreed. "Hell, I already thought of that. I was even going to suggest it, but I figured you might prefer to stay on the boat. I don't often get to spend as much time on the boat as I did today." Nancy replied, "That's settled. Let's go get our things and come back." She hugged Kenneth tightly and said, "Thanks for inviting us on this trip, buddy," smiling at him. She placed her beautiful feet on his left leg. All day I tried to forget everything that had happened, but every little thing reminded me of my fantasies. Kenneth was quick to laugh. "I think of you both as my family. It's my pleasure." We made it back to shore in about 30 minutes, and Nancy seemed to take a second breath, saying, "Let's all go back. I want to change into the dress we bought today." Kenneth happily agreed, and the answer to his questions was always yes. I had no choice, and I too wanted to go out and relax at a table by the sea. I was still a little hungover and thought Nancy might be too. although she didn't look it if she was. Kenneth and I were ready within minutes, and Nancy needed a little more time to get ready. I didn't want to think about it, but her having a full bathroom and being able to take a real shower certainly made a difference. She came out of the bathroom in a mini sundress with 4-inch heels, and I, as well as Kenneth, was amazed. Nancy looked at both of us and laughed. "My goodness, I can feel you both ogling me. Is that a compliment?" Kenneth replied, "Honey, you make men simply lose their heads." She laughed again and added, "I don't try to make all men fall into stupidity, just my 2 special ones who love me." We all laughed, but I took a little offense at the mention of Kenneth in her comment. I decided not to dwell on it, however. Eventually, we left the hotel, made our way to the bar downstairs, and walked to the back patio, where we slowly began to be served drinks. There was no waitress, so we walked up to the bar ourselves to get our drinks and carry them to our table. After a round of drinks and some time spent talking, I headed to the bar. There, standing at the bar, I saw Nancy take off her shoe and put her foot on Kenneth's, as if he had asked her to do so. I couldn't hear what they were saying since I was 30 feet away from them, but I realized it had already started happening last time. I watched it. It all looked innocent enough, but I sensed that there was more behind it than just chatter. All I could see was the movement of their lips. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I could see Nancy giggling and answering no. The more I waited, the more it annoyed me. Then I moved to the opposite side of the bar and waited for my drinks to be brought to me. I could see Kenneth and Nancy through the plants that separated us, but they didn't know where I was. Our table was a fairly secluded spot, so I figured that if they were really discussing something, they wouldn't pay too much attention to me. I noticed Nancy perk up a bit and look around the bar where she had last seen me. Their conversation went something like this. "I'm not sure where he went," Nancy said, and I continued to watch as Kenneth, with his mouth covered, headed toward the bar and said something to her. As he spoke, Nancy smiled slightly, her lips ajar, and she replied, "No," shaking her head. He continued to talk to her, and her expression changed from a playful no to something more serious. Then Nancy looked in my direction, as if trying to see me, and then she touched her face and started to say something to Kenneth. He just waved his hand, and they both went back to their normal conversation, as if I hadn't been there at all. Something inside me was stirring, telling me that they weren't really interested in what kind of drinks I was bringing. Back at the table, Nancy immediately asked, "Where'd you disappear to, kid? First you were here, and then you disappeared." I replied, "Oh, I had to go to the men's room. That's okay." We sat drinking our drinks for about an hour when Nancy suggested, "Let's go to bed early if we're going to the tour marathon tomorrow." Kenneth quickly agreed, and I followed suit. I was dumbfounded at the thought of Nancy making any plans with Kenneth. It tormented me. Eventually, we left the bar and went back to the hotel, where neither of us were very drunk, just pleasantly relaxed. I was so consumed with my thoughts that I devised a plan to find out what was going on there. I wasn't going to share a room with them, but the room was spacious enough that Kenneth decided to make himself comfortable on the fold-out couch in the living room. Perhaps I was the odd man out, but I started opening the curtains and blinds, not because I wanted to get air in, but to be able to observe. I just had to find out what was going on between them. It was driving me mad. I was deeply upset, convinced that everything was my fault, that this whole situation could have been avoided if I had just left it alone. She wouldn't have ended up in the same bed with him if it hadn't been for me. Tortured by these thoughts, I suddenly said, "Damn, I forgot my sneakers on the boat. I'll run in and get them real quick. I can't walk in the Mexican hills in flip-flops." Kenneth, like a good guy, replied, "Don't worry, I'll go get them myself. We'll check to make sure everything is in place." I replied to assure her that she never does anything without my consent. I thought about what I could say, though, the wildest things that would enrage her. I kissed her wildly and caressed her with my fingers. "I want him with you while I'm gone." She didn't say a word. I just kept kissing and fondling her with my fingers. Now I really wanted to hear her answer, whatever it was. I was desperate. I wanted to hear something like, "No, are you fucking crazy? Kiss my ass. You need help. Any answer would have been fine. I continued, I'm not even going back to the boat. I want you to be with him right now, and then I'm going to take you to the beach where those guys are going to look at the boat and watch you with them. And then she closed her eyes and gasped. God, that's so dirty. You meant Kenneth, didn't you? It affected me so deeply that I couldn't find the words. I knew Nancy better than anyone, and her answer and look spoke volumes. I replied in shock, Yes, let's start with Kenneth. Then she said, Michael, I love you so much. I thought you were crazy, but I can't believe how much you enjoy this. I mean, you seriously enjoy it, and it turns me on. This is so wrong, so dirty. We shouldn't be doing this, baby. I can't even look at his face while you're watching. Is that okay?